Well, welcome to another Monday morning. I hope you guys are going to have a good week this week, and I just want to talk a little bit. Just about everybody has dealt with issues regarding communication, either from service advisors or customers or your service manager, or parts man, or whoever. But poorly written work orders can cause even the most competent technician a lot of grief. If you don't have all the information, you might wind up working a long time on something. Like, for example, when somebody describes a noise and they don't use the right words, somebody that's chasing that noise might find a noise that they think is the noise the person is talking about. But it turns out the customer will say, no, I wasn't even talking about that noise. I was talking about this other noise that happens at this other time. So you've already burned 2 hours fixing a noise that wasn't the noise they were complaining about. I've run into that myself, and it's a little bit annoying because you've done all that work, you see. But that's why clear communication needs to be, drive the car with the customer and let them say exactly what it is you want me to fix. You may hear stuff that you don't like that you would fix if it was your car that they're not even bothered with. And so you always need to make sure you vector in on what they're complaining about because they're the one paying the bill. But you could say rotate tires, change oil, that kind of stuff. That's pretty straightforward. Replace fuel filter, blah blah. But there are also times when the service advisors at the place where I used to work anyway, before I, left and went to teaching, was the work would be coming in so fast they'd be having to write the work orders. They didn't want to keep the customers waiting a long time. And there was questionnaires customers were supposed to fill out for intermittent concerns and all that. And of course also the service advisors toward the end here and got to where they would walk around the car and take pictures of it from every angle and attach that to the file in the computer. So if the customer came back and said, hey, this dent or this scratch wasn't on my car before, if they see a cigarette burn on the seat, they take a picture of that before anybody's ever got in the car. Because sometimes customers will come back and say, hey, they burned my seat with a cigarette, I want a new seat, blah, 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 and all that kind of thing. I've seen that. But anyway, this one here was kind of funny. I didn't draw this ticket, but another guy in the shop did, and it said, windshield won't separate rain from water. What does that even mean? I mean, what are you supposed to do with that information? And the guy that wrote it was a pretty good service writer. He was just sort of addled and he had a lot of stuff going, and he wrote down something that didn't even make any sense. And when you're the technician and you look at this work order, you think, what am I supposed to do about this, And that was just plumb funny. But this other one that was totally amazing to me was there was this service advisor that I worked with. There was 4 service advisors out there. We got tickets from various ones of them. And this guy's name was Curtis, and he brought me this. I drew a ticket from the dispatch office that had, they got repair lines on them, like a repair 1, repair 2, and then whenever you're charging out the parts, you need to tell the parts room which repair line you're charging out the part for, so they can annotate that for this part was supposed to fix this problem, etc. But this one here, the very first repair line, and this was a warranty ticket, said you have to turn on the left turn signal before the engine will start. The unit won't start unless left turn signal is turned on. I said, man, that is an interesting problem. I've never heard of that in my life. And so I go to digging around, looking around, checking to find out why this is like this. And I spent about 30 minutes tracking it and took some of the, the steering column covers off and all that. And I found out they had deliberately wired it up this way as their idea of an anti-theft device. So even if somebody had the key, they weren't likely to turn on the left turn signal before they started the car. And so I go out to the service writer and I said, Curtis, why did you put this up here on the first repair line if the customer has wired it up this way? He says, oh, I put that on there so you would know how to start it. And I'm thinking, why in the Sam Hill didn't you put a sticky note on the ticket or something instead of putting it on a repair line? Which was the dumbest thing. He could have basically made some kind of an annotation on there saying information only or whatever, customer has wired it up this way. But see, the communication, that cost me some work because he actually put it on there like it was something I was supposed to fix. The dumbest thing. But anyway, I could tell you a lot of stories about that knothead. This was one, a different service writer wrote this one up, and I could do a whole presentation on this one when I'm out one day. But another mechanic drew this ticket, and it had an ABS light. You know, we saw that fairly regularly on some of these late, mid-90s Rangers. And this was one of the ones that would actually store codes. You know, some of the earlier rear anti-lock brake systems wouldn't store codes. And so he pulled up, I don't know, a code 12 or whatever it was. And that typically indicated that there was a problem with the fluid level switch on the reservoir. And so you couldn't just get the switch then, you had to get the whole reservoir, which didn't cost that much anyway. And he went ahead and replaced the reservoir, which is what he always did for that problem, cleared the code, drove it around, checked it out, brought it back, turned in the ticket. The customer came to pick it up, and he hadn't gone anywhere before he wheeled right back in to the write-up area. And the service advisor, whenever a situation like that arises, I get called out there, even though I didn't even work on it. And so he said, this guy says that his vehicle's not fixed, and so-and-so Sam or whatever his name is put a reservoir. So I says, well, what's the deal is? He goes, this is what the deal is. He says, everything's fine. You don't ever see the ABS light until you mash the park brake. And then the red ABS light, the red brake light comes on, and the yellow ABS light comes on. And then when you pop the park brake off, the red brake light goes out, but the ABS light stays on. See, that was not even laid out on the ticket. It just basically said ABS light comes on sometimes. And so who's going to think to mash the park brake? Maybe I'll talk about that one and show you guys some schematics in a later video. But that was another one where communication, sort of fell on its face. But I had written a Motor Rage article about this. It's kind of funny. And when it came out in the magazine was being passed around the service department and all. And the service writer came out there in a huff, and he says, the way you wrote this article, it makes it sound like this was all my fault. I said, well, it kind of was, because you didn't get all the information from the guy, or if you did, you didn't put it on the repair order. That service writer was always a little bit, he was funny anyway. He was a good service writer, but he didn't like to admit when he made mistakes. And one day, I was riding with the shop foreman, because he would always, for a while, he had to drive a lot of the vehicles we worked on to make sure they were okay before we turned in the ticket and all. There was some kind of an issue. That the service manager made that ruling that for the next 6 weeks, the shop foreman is going to, test drive each car with you and all that. He's always supposed to do it after you've had a repeat repair. And I told this the shop foreman, I says, what you're doing is what's called quality control. And he kind of liked the sound of that. And so he went and had a stamp made that said QC in big letters. And then it had little lines down here about where he was supposed to sign off on it. And so every time we would get a repeat repair ticket, the service writer would stamp QC on it with that big red stamp. And they loved doing that. They'd stamp one of those and give it back to the mechanic that worked on it, whether it was his fault or not. And it was one of those things that were, when you did everything you could to fix it right, and they cheerfully hand you, because by that time they had you'd turn your tickets into the regular dispatcher, but they had the service writers dispatching tickets to their group of mechanics. And the service writers just really liked handing you those, because they knew that it kind of ticked you off a little bit. You get this little anger spike when you get one of those, because that means you got to disengage from whatever else you're doing and figure out what happened here. And sometimes it was the mechanic's fault, sometimes it wasn't. But one day, the service advisor, this same service advisor that wrote this one up, made a mistake of some kind writing the ticket. And I enjoyed catching him in a mistake as much as he enjoyed catching me. And so I took his QC stamp, and I put a little sticky note up there on the ticket, and I stamped it, that sticky note, QC, and then above that I wrote, Service Advisor QC, you made a mistake. And whenever I handed him that was so funny to me, he angrily jerked his sticky note off, and he wads it up, gritting his teeth, and he throws it in the trash. And I said, now you know how it feels to get one of these. I still get tickled every time I think about that. Well, this Dodge Caravan came into the college over there. 179,000 miles, 3.3 liter engine, and all that. And the girl said, and some of these customers have funny ways of saying things. She says, my van is janking when I drive. I didn't think I would make it here. And well, that's obviously a sort of a word that was created between between jerk and yank, I guess, or something. That's what she came out. But I kind of figured out what she meant. But I sent one of my more seasoned students with the owner on a test drive, and the student came back and says it's a surge, but it only did it a couple of times, kind of briefly. And the code we pulled was for an inactive or slow O2 sensor, which on a Chrysler can happen anywhere within the O2 sensor's range. Now on a Ford, an O2 sensor will either be sluggish or it will flatline, or and it'll cause it to skew the fuel trims and all that. But on these Dodges and Chryslers and these vintage ever since about, 1988 on up through the 90s, those oxygen sensors could fail just above the half volt, which is a crossover, the switch point, from rich to lean, and they would fail at like, 0.58 volts and just float along there. And this is what I'm talking about. The fuel trim responds to the oxygen sensor. Now what you'll notice here is that whenever the oxygen sensor voltage is going up, the fuel trim voltage is going down. Alright, and then whenever this oxygen sensor voltage peaks out and starts back down, the fuel trim starts going back up. This is a sawtooth pattern I created, but that's what it looks like. And this is short fuel trim now, remember that. Long fuel trim is going to float around pretty close, to zero if everything's like it's supposed to be. But if the short fuel trim, for example, like if the oxygen sensor is indicating lean fuel, like if it's too lean, the short fuel trim will go up and up and up and up. It'll stay up in this area up here. Or if it's reading too rich, it'll go down and stay in this area down here. When it maxes out, then the long fuel trim kicks in and it starts trying to make course adjustments so that it can bring this short fuel trim back around zero. So you may find your long fuel trim at like 25%, minus 25%. But you'll see your short fuel trim at zero because the long fuel trim has been able to make an adjustment to keep the thing in spec, where it's giving you clean exhaust emissions, but it's having to twist everything out of. But what happens on these, and I've seen it on more than one of these Chrysler Dodge platforms, but I've never seen it on anything else. Some of you other guys might have. That thing fails just above the midpoint of this switch. The short fuel trim goes down, down, down as far as it can go, and then the long fuel trim tries to make a course adjustment, but it realizes that nothing is changing up here while it's doing what it's doing down here. And what it does, the way the algorithm is written, it drops in and out of closed loop fuel control, and that thing will buck and jerk and jump, and sometimes I've actually had them where they would just about quit running because of a dadgum oxygen sensor. Doing something like this, the 91 model Dodge truck that our president of the college drove pulled that stunt, and I wound up having to put an oxygen sensor on that one. And that took care of that. But having your scan tool and being able to look at this. Now I will tell you that you can read your oxygen sensor with a scope, but you cannot read the fuel trim with a scope. You have to be looking at a scan tool that's a window into the PCM where you can watch that fuel trim work. And every time I've seen this, it's always been this bucking and jumping stuff. First time I saw it, I was using the Mopar diagnostic system, and you can make a recording and come back and load it up and play it back, All right, but anyway, so we found this, that, if this was something we'd seen, that would make it buck and jank and jerk and all that. And so we had verified the concern, we had isolated the cause, we gathered the data, and we analyzed it. We had prior experience, or I did, based on what was going to be causing this, and we're looking at our scan tool screen, we saw this going on. We determined the necessary action to correct it, and we landed on the oxygen sensor. Now the caveat was, this girl was leaving the vehicle with us, and she was going on a field trip with some of the other faculty, some of the other faculty and students to Montgomery, Alabama, and so she was going to leave, and I was going to put the key under the floor mat, but she paid the bill before she left for what the oxygen sensor was going to cost. I figured up the bill and just totaled up the bill, and we went ahead and put it back together while she's gone on her field trip on the bus up to Montgomery. So when we thought we were done with this doggone thing, we went ahead and we drove it. And the crazy thing about it was, it developed another problem. And I'll tell you about that in just a minute. But you know, talking about service advisors, they don't like giving customers bad news. And whenever they will come out there, you know, you do the best troubleshooting you can, you get as close as you can to the complete diagnosis. But until you start taking that thing apart, there's other stuff that you won't find until you've done the first repair. And that's why every shop manual that I've ever seen that has any kind of, you know, sense about it will say verify repair. It always says verify repair. Now, if you try to verify the repair and you find something else, you're going to have to work on it some more. But service advisors hated that. They wanted to go to the customer and say, this is all your car needs, and you'll never even need so much as another oil change as long as you own the car, and you'll never have any more trouble with it. You'll never see another check engine light if you'll let us put this one part on there. But when the service, right, and so you say, well, what we have on this one is such and such a part has failed. And they'll say, and that's going to fix it, right? They always say it that way, and you're thinking, I don't know until I get this put on there, and I'll have to check further. They did not like that. I don't know how many times I crossed up with one service writer after another one like that, about that. So anyway, so that, you know, the bad tidings situation comes. And I've actually seen some service writers. One time I went out there to get a tempo, and I didn't look at the tag on the key, and I didn't look at the tag on that. But the only tempo I saw out there was actually two, but I didn't see the other one. Believe it or not, I unlocked the door, or I might not have had to unlock the door. Anyway, the key that I had in my hand started the wrong tempo. It just happened to start the other car. And based on the way the thing was written up and what it did whenever I backed up, the engine stalled. And I said, wow. And so I did my diagnostics, and it needed an engine controller. And so I went to the service advisor and I said, this thing's going to have an engine controller on it. You know, stalled when I was backing up, and I checked it. He said, okay, we'll put it on there. So I got one from the parts room, put it on there. Car was fixed, everything was fine. Test drove it, put it back, rode it up. And then I realized I had fixed the wrong car. And it was like $350, you know, parts and labor at the time. So I went back to the service writer and I said, look, I fixed the wrong car. And I said, I don't know what we're going to have to do about that if this guy doesn't want to, you know, the other owner doesn't want to pay this. And he says, but the car that is the proper car, all it needs is a throttle position sensor. And it's only going to be $60, you know, for the part and a little bit of labor. And he says, since we gave him bad information to start with, can we do this for free? I says, no, we can't do it for free, Curtis, because the guy's already okayed $350. He'll be really happy with $60 plus a little bit of labor. So no, he's going to pay. This is ridiculous. Because he wanted to be the hero, saying, tell the guy, you're not going to have to pay anything else. I don't know how many times I saw this guy do that kind of thing. All right, this one here, when we drove it, this time around, to verify the repair, now we're seeing a flashing battery light, and this thing is cutting up so bad it won't even hardly run. The alternator's not putting out, the battery's trying to go dead while we're driving it. Barely did get back to the shop on it. And this is probably what she was feeling, but I got some questions about this that I'm talking about later. So she was expecting to get back from that trip, jump off the bus, get on her vehicle, and drive it home. So I had to find out from the student services people what her cell phone number was, and we had to get her on the phone, and we had to say, look, this ain't fixed, we're going to have to work on it. And I said, I'm thinking there's an alternator issue here. But anyway, that's, you know, that was a dicey situation, and I'll tell you how it turned out in a minute. But first I want to talk about this 83 Renault that I worked on. Now this thing would cut up and cut off going down the road. And when I went to school in Atlanta a whole bunch of times in 1988 and 89, right after we got the Jeep Renault franchise at our dealership, I would go in there and I would just went time after time after time to school, and the instructor addressed this kind of ignition module. Now the later ones didn't have this, but you notice this one here had that little vacuum diaphragm on everything. He says if you can reach back here, and he's talking about reaching right up under the module back here to where that potting is in the back of the module. If you mash that potting with your fingers and the engine stalls, then that module has got to be replaced. And so I couldn't get it to act up. I drove it, and finally checking it out in the service bay, I reached around behind the module and mashed the potting, and the engine died, just like that guy said. I mean, oh wow, we learned about this in school. So I put the module on there, and it was $130 or something like that. So this guy took the car. Well, he came back the next day and he said, this car's still quitting. And he said, I need you to find out what's wrong with it, because I don't think that module was, what the problem was. I said, well, oh, that's, that's what I found. But anyway, so I hooked my meter up to the crank sensor just on a whim and put the meter where I could see it. And when I drove down the road and it quit, the crank sensor had gone dark. Now it wouldn't do that the previous day, but it did do it with the customer, and it did it with me this time, but it wouldn't do it the previous time. And I found what I thought was wrong. You see, I mean, you can do everything as right as you know and still miss something. Anyway, this guy drove away from there just absolutely certain that we had just thrown a part at it without even doing any diagnosis, and that we had missed it. I think the crank sensor was like $29, and I think we just gave him that and the replacement of that without another troubleshooting, charge. But anyway, that's one of those situations where you try, you're trying to do your very best you can do with the information you have and all that. And this wasn't a communication issue, it was the fact that the car wouldn't cooperate. And everybody that's done intermittent drivability diagnostics understands how that works. Well, on the charging system on this Caravan, I said, let's go ahead and see what's going on with that. So we did a little tear down on it. You can see how this works, and I've always been interested in these Chryslers, how they have the automatic shutdown relay that feeds the injectors, and the engine controller also feeds the power to the field on the alternator, and the generator field driver in the module, engine control module, is actually what decides how much, it knows what the battery voltage is and everything, so it works really well to do that. And that's a pretty solid system, really. It's been around since the mid-'80s, as I remember, on Chryslers. But anyway, this, I told her, I said, this thing needs a $200 alternator. And she said, well, I don't have any more money. So I said, okay, so let me show you what we saw here. The brushes were all it was worn out. And that's real common on alternators over time. If they got a lot of miles on it, the brushes on the alternator can fail. And you can see what it does to the slip rings. I actually did a little bit of a piece for Motor Age on the Vistion people that do that rebuild alternators and starters and stuff. And what they do is they measure these rings, and they basically build them up where they're like brand new, and get rid of this nonsense here. They said, and the Vistion guy told me when I was talking to him, he said, most alternator rebuilders just throw a new set of brushes in there, but we measure those slip rings, and we measure a lot of other stuff that other alternator rebuilders don't do. That's when last time I told you I got 4 rebuilt alternators from AutoZone that time. I don't know how they are now, but that was that time. And but anyway, the Vistion guy told me about that. But you can see where this brush here was worn out really bad. That was the one that was here. This one wasn't worn out quite so bad. That was this one up here. And so we went ahead and got some more another set of brushes in the little brush holder thing right here out of a another alternator that we had, and we fixed it and got her on the way. It test drove just fine. But my question was, why didn't she mention the battery light or any dead battery problems when she first came in? She had ridden with us on the first test drive, and she verified that the surge was what we were supposed to be looking for. Next question, maybe she hadn't noticed the flashing battery light, or maybe it was a coincidental failure, and those do happen. Was this truly an information disconnect or just a circumstantial landmine, And I've talked, that's my little phrase I coined about this kind of stuff, where you step on something you didn't see that was there and it blows up in your face, What do we do when we spent most of what somebody had in their checking account on a repair that we were sure was totally legit, and this is something they needed, but we find out they have another more expensive problem that keeps the car from leaving? That kind of thing happens too. Customers are never happy about that. but it's like you're sort of painting yourself into a corner, and you know they kind of need to be told going in, and there may be other stuff going on. Well, this is one customer that was really happy with all the work that we had done for her, and it was after I left the college and and went into retirement that she sent me this text with this picture of her odometer, and we had done a lot of work over the years on her Honda, and she says, thanks to you, Honda and I made it thanks to you, and she's got this 300,000 mile odometer. And, that's a satisfactory message to get from somebody. Well, this is the end of the video, and I hope you guys have a great week, and let's all be careful out there.